Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy 2018. Hi everybody, I'm Bob Ottenhoff, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Today's webinar is a special showcase of the 5th annual report, Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy 2018, Data to Drive Decisions. We'll provide background on the project, describe the research methodology, lift up key findings from this year's report, and hear about a couple of the specific disasters. Today's webinar is divided into 3 sections. First, I'll be joined by Larry McGill to look at the results of the new report, focused on data from 2016 and its accompanying tools. Larry is the Vice President of Knowledge Services and led Foundation Center's team on this project. Next, we'll do a deeper dive into the 2016 philanthropic response by focusing on one of the biggest disasters that year, the Flint Water Crisis. Our guest for that discussion will be LeeAnne Walters. And then finally, we'll open up the floor for your questions. I encourage you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy of the recording. We'll also post the full recording and summary on our website. And we of course encourage you to tweet your thoughts about the data and the webinar at hashtag SODP2018. Before we dive into the data, I'd like to take a moment to thank our generous funders. We appreciate the generous lead support of the Irene W. and C.B. Pennington Foundation and the additional funding provided by the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Thanks so much for your support. The work we're sharing with you today builds on a partnership between the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and Foundation Center, one that taps into the respective strengths and expertise of each of our organizations. CDP's mission is to transform disaster giving by providing timely and thoughtful strategies to increase donors' impact during domestic and international disasters. CDP aims to increase the effectiveness of contributions given to disasters, bring greater attention to the life cycle of disasters from preparedness and planning to relief, to rebuilding, recovery, and resilience efforts, and provide timely and relevant advice from experts with deep knowledge of disaster philanthropy. Foundation Center has been around for more than 60 years and is the leading source of data and information on philanthropy worldwide. Our partnership with Foundation Center allows us to collect and share better data about disaster philanthropy, so that funders will have knowledge and tools to be more effective in their disaster-related giving. Disasters, by definition, are generally unpredictable, so we tend not to think about them until they happen. Although disasters may not be predictable, they do happen with regularity. At CDP, we've long believed that the scope, scale, and frequency of disasters will only intensify. We've witnessed that this year with the recent spate of disasters, including typhoons that devastated parts of Southeast Asia and U.S. territories, hurricanes Florence and Michael that wreaked havoc in the Carolinas and Florida here in the U.S., as well as volcano eruptions in Hawaii and Guatemala. Foundation Center has thus far tracked more than $50 million in pledges for Hurricane Florence and more than $30 million for Hurricane Michael, primarily from corporations, but also from foundations and public charities. As of November 13, Foundation Center has recorded about $750,000 pledged by corporations and company-sponsored foundations towards the California wildfires, some of the worst the state has ever experienced. Foundation Center will continue to monitor the wildfires, and you can find updates on their Philanthropy News Digest site. While disasters may shock us, they shouldn't surprise us. They will happen, and philanthropy will be called upon to respond. Given the inevitability of disasters, it's imperative for funders to make use of their dollars in the most effective way possible. In that spirit, our report and tools focus on three key questions. First, how does the funding community respond to disasters? What do they fund? How much funding do they provide overall? Second, how does the foundation response to disasters fit into the larger landscape of giving? How does foundation funding compare to other sources of funding, such as corporate giving, bilateral, multilateral aid, and government assistance? And third, what can funders do to become more effective in terms of disaster-related funding? Now I'm going to turn over the microphone to Larry McGill from the Foundation Center, who's going to try to answer those questions for you. Larry.
Thank you very much, Bob. And let me just say also what a pleasure it has been to be able to work with you and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for more than 5 years now to put these reports together. It's been a really productive partnership and one that we really value. So thanks for the opportunity to work with you on these projects. So to examine the questions that Bob was just mentioning, our team at Foundation Center started this process more than 5 years ago by working with an expert technical advisory committee to develop a project taxonomy that allows us to classify various types of disasters as well as assistance strategies. Disaster types can be classified as natural disasters. This would include floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. Man-made accidents, which could include things like oil spills and building collapses, or complex humanitarian emergencies, like the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen. In addition, we have a fourth bucket that we include in our analysis, disasters in general, which includes unspecified funding for disasters or funding that goes to multiple disparate disasters. We also examine disaster assistance strategies. These strategies cover the full life cycle of disasters, from resilience, risk reduction, and mitigation, to preparedness, to response and relief, and finally to long-term reconstruction and recovery. This is the fifth annual report we published using this taxonomy as our guiding framework. For this year's report, we examined 2016 funding, which is the latest year for which complete data are available and allows us to provide a snapshot of foundation giving for the year as it played out in terms of various disasters. Major disasters and humanitarian crises affected millions of people globally in 2016. You may recall Hurricane Matthew causing widespread devastation in Haiti and several islands in the Caribbean, as well as the southeastern parts of the United States. An earthquake struck the coast of Ecuador in April, which was the worst natural disaster to hit the country since 1949, killing hundreds and injuring thousands of people. Civil unrest in Syria and Yemen continued, further increasing the number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people. In the United States, intense storms and flooding affected Louisiana, West Virginia, Texas, and Maryland. Deadly wildfires burned through thousands of acres of national park in Tennessee. In January, the Obama administration declared the Flint Water Crisis a federal state of emergency in Michigan. Drawing upon 12 different data sources, we were able to document approximately $30 billion in disaster-related giving in 2016. In this year's report, for the first time, we examined funding beyond the largest U.S. foundations and include in the overall analysis contributions made by non-U.S. donors, public charities, and smaller U.S. foundations. This enables us to see a much broader picture of institutional disaster philanthropy. We identified $199.9 million in funding for disasters and humanitarian crises based on Foundation Center's data. This includes transactions by U.S. foundations and public charities, as well as non-U.S. donors. Almost half of the funding, 44%, went to natural disasters. In this category, nearly $32 million was for flooding, particularly in Louisiana, which was struck by two extremely large flood events, one in March and another in August. Man-made accidents received 15%, with several large grants addressing the Flint Water Crisis. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, for example, gave 16 grants related to health interventions, early childhood education, and economic development in recovery funding for the Flint Water Crisis. 11% of funding was directed to complex humanitarian emergencies, such as the crisis in Syria, and 30% was for disasters in general. When you turn to assistance strategies, the largest proportion of foundation funding, as it typically is, 42%, went to response and relief efforts. And this was an increase of 6% from 2015. 17% went toward reconstruction and recovery. More than half of this was related to the Flint water crisis. 8% of funding went toward resilience measures, and only 5% was allocated for disaster preparedness. As an example of a reconstruction and recovery grant, the Annenberg Foundation in California donated $100,000 to Peace Winds America to construct community centers as part of its Nepal earthquake recovery program. In 2016, 60% of grant dollars went to North America, 15% to Asia, 6% for Africa, 4% for Europe and Russia, 3% for the Caribbean, and 1% for Latin America and Mexico. Funding in 2016 shifted back to North America. In 2015, it was only 37%. In previous years, proportionately more funding was directed, for example, to Africa in response to the Ebola outbreak. As an example of funding directed for Europe and Russia, the UK Big Lottery Fund donated more than $15,000 to the Crantock Surf Life Saving Club in Cornwall to provide flood response training to volunteers. Responding to disasters is an enormous task that no single sector can accomplish on its own. And one of the reasons for doing the work that we do is to put the work of philanthropy into that larger context. Here's a quick rundown of what giving looks like from other sources. You can see the $199.9 million there at the top of the left-hand column that came from institutional philanthropy, most of which is based in the US, based on our data. According to survey data published by the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, 258 of the world's largest companies directed an estimated $148.1 million towards disaster relief in 2016. So that's a sizable contribution from corporate giving, but again, represents only what we know about 258 of the world's largest companies. So it's not by any means all corporate giving represented there. When you look at individual donations, we have some information from Development Initiatives, which publishes the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which reported an estimated $4.1 billion in private donations by individuals for international humanitarian crises. You don't see that number on this chart, but it gives you an overall idea of how much giving is provided by individual donors. This represents 68% of all international giving, international humanitarian assistance from private donors, including both individuals and institutions. So how do individuals give? Well, we have some examples here. Individuals often donate via online platforms and crowdfunding sites. We took a look at two online platforms for illustrative purposes, Global Giving and Network for Good. In 2016, Network for Good helped direct $6.8 million in donations for disasters and humanitarian crises through their giving portals. Global Giving raised $3.8 million for disasters, supporting 162 projects by 127 organizations. Global Giving's Italy Earthquake Relief and Recovery Fund raised the most money at $1.5 million. The Hurricane Matthew Relief Fund raised the highest number of contributions at 27. Individuals are also increasingly giving through donor-advised funds, such as those managed by Fidelity Charitable and Vanguard Charitable. Based on 2016 data, individuals gave $8.2 million through Fidelity and $662,000 through Vanguard for disasters and humanitarian crises. But by far, the largest flows of aid for disasters and humanitarian crises come from governments. Governments distribute bilateral aid or giving to other countries. Official development assistance by 29 government members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, totaled $19.6 billion for disasters and humanitarian crises. And this was nearly a $3 billion increase from the previous year. 60% of this money was for complex humanitarian emergencies and 10% for natural disasters. Non-DAC government donors and multilateral organizations contributed an additional $1.8 billion, with 80% of this also given to complex humanitarian emergencies and 4% to natural disasters. Looking back at the United States, FEMA, the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, distributed $3.7 billion in grants and assistance for domestic disasters in 2016. This was a $1.5 billion increase from the previous year. Of this money, 2/3, or $2.3 billion, was for floods. The top recipient states of FEMA grants were Louisiana, Texas, and South Carolina. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, allocated $353 million in recovery efforts in 2016 to states and local governments to recover from 2015 disasters, including Hurricanes Joaquin and Patricia. Funds were used toward eligible disaster recovery activities, including housing rehabilitation, public improvements, and economic development. So between FEMA and HUD, you have good examples of relief efforts as well as reconstruction and recovery efforts. Combined with foundation funding, as we mentioned, all of this comes to $30 billion for disaster assistance in 2016. When considering foundation funding, it is important to understand this broader mosaic of disaster and humanitarian aid. Now let's look a little bit more closely at trends over time, since we've been doing this work now for 5 years. An analysis of funding, when you focus on the 1,000 largest U.S. foundations each year between 2012 and 2016, shows that large U.S. foundations contributed on average about $150 million per year for disasters. There was a dramatic upward spike in 2014 due to large grants for the Ebola outbreak, after which funding declined over the next 2 years. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has consistently been the top donor over the last 5 years of our analysis. In 2016, they awarded over $22.5 million in grants. Over the 5-year period, their total is $183.3 million, or more than what we typically see in an average year on an annual basis for all foundations. The next slide shows that funding trends tend to be episodic and dependent upon crises. Natural disasters at 59% on average was the largest focus of disaster funders. In 2015, foundations increased funding for complex humanitarian emergencies to 17%. This was in response to the Syrian war and the refugee crisis. Man-made accidents accounted for no more than 3% of dollars every year, except in 2016, the focus of our current report, when funding jumped to 20% due to contamination of drinking water in Flint, Michigan. Finally, response and relief efforts are the most funded assistance strategy. Across all years, funding for response and relief averaged 47% of all disaster funding, peaking in 2014 at 73% due to large grants addressing the Ebola outbreak. Recovery efforts increased in 2013 to 19% after Superstorm Sandy, and in 2016 following the Flint Water Crisis. And resilience and risk reduction funding increased slightly in 2015 to 17% in the wake of the Ebola outbreak. So you can see how these things track according to the type of disasters that people are focusing on. Bob, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Larry. That's Larry McGill from the Foundation Center. The analysis you've been hearing from Larry can be downloaded for free from the site disasterphilanthropy.foundationcenter.org. The PDF report is complemented by the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy dashboard, which allows users to interact with the data based on their specific areas of interest. The dashboard provides analysis and aggregated data. For users interested in seeing details at the grant or disbursement level, we've also built a mapping platform that visualizes who's funding what and where. Every Tuesday for the next several weeks, CDP will be releasing how-to videos to help you learn how to use the dashboard and mapping platform on an in-depth level. The first was released yesterday. Nicknamed Tutorial Tuesday, it's a way to help you use these tools to your greatest advantage. Taking into account both large and smaller regional foundations, as well as public charities and international foundations, we documented nearly 200 million in giving from foundations in 2016. It's clear that foundations bring substantial resources to the table. At the same time, across all sectors, we found $30 billion in giving. Thus, it's imperative that the larger network of government, private, and corporate foundations, donors, build partnerships that can help maximize and leverage limited dollars. We believe the tools that we've developed can help donors to understand the funding landscape more fully and identify opportunities to address funding gaps, increase collaboration, and make more strategic decisions. You can help us make these tools more robust. We invite foundations and corporate donors to share their data with us directly. One of the challenges in reporting is that we often have limited information about what specific disaster assistance strategies are employed. When sharing data, we invite funders to provide more precise descriptions so that we can understand more fully how donors are investing across the disaster lifecycle. Our analysis relies on publicly available data, but we know there's additional giving we're not accounting for, particularly from foundations outside of the US, smaller and regional foundations, and corporate giving. Ultimately, the more we can do on this front, the better equipped our tools will be to foster greater collaboration and coordination in the field. Please contact Grace Sato, GMS, you can see here her email address here, gms@foundationcenter.org, at Foundation Center, if you'd like to add your data. And we're excited to share that coming next year, Foundation Center, CDP, and the Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy will collaborate on new research that examines how U.S. households gave toward disasters in 2017. So stay tuned. We hope one of the takeaways from today's session is to realize that response and relief is just part of a larger picture that takes the full disaster life cycle into account. In the last few months, we've seen hurricanes, super typhoons, and earthquakes cause devastation in several countries across the globe. And while it's been heartening to see organizations and individuals enthusiastically respond in the immediate aftermath of these events, there's a real opportunity for philanthropists to be less reactive and more strategic in their disaster-related investments. The full life cycle of disasters encompasses on the front end risk reduction, mitigation, preparedness, and resilience efforts that can minimize the economic and human losses associated with disasters. And at the back, on the back end, recovery and reconstruction efforts that can help communities rebuild and thrive following the devastation of disasters. Although few, if any, foundations consider themselves to be disaster philanthropists, all foundations will at some time or another find themselves facing the question of how best to respond when disasters occur. Like all other forms of philanthropy, a strategic approach is typically more effective than an ad hoc approach. A goal of CDP and of this project is to raise awareness of the fact that all funders have a role to play with respect to disaster philanthropy. This report provides funders with the data and tools they need to play that role effectively. Now, in a few minutes, we'll be taking your questions. We have a few already, and thank you to those who have sent in their questions. If you have a question for Larry or myself, you can do so by going to the bottom of your screen and using the Q&A box at the bottom there. And we'll try to get to your question before this webinar ends. We want to bring in a new perspective on the data that we've been talking about. And we're pleased today that joining us is LeeAnne Walters, a Flint resident turned water activist and citizen scientist who played a pivotal role in exposing the Flint Water Crisis. She volunteers her time fighting to get the lead and copper rule changed and clean water everywhere. She's also the recipient of the 2016 Penn, Tony, and James C. Goodall Freedom of Expression Courage Award, the 2016 Health Policy Heroes Award, and the Champion of Children Award, and the 2016 Smithsonian Social Progress Award. Most recently, she won the 2018 Goldman Environmental Prize. Ms. Walters, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me join.
I know you're very busy, but we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today as we try to really get a human perspective on all the numbers we've been listening to for the last 30 minutes. And my first question to you is, how are you and your family doing?
Well, we are still dealing with the health effects from the Flint Water Crisis. We still get the rashes that we were getting back in 2015 in the same areas. I have 7-year-old twins who get diagnosed with things at different times. Most recently, my children were diagnosed with hand-eye coordination issues and speech impairments due to the contamination from the lead. And one of my sons, who has a pre-existing compromised immune system, has been tested for everything under the sun to figure out what's going on with his liver, and we have not yet figured that out yet.
So the crisis is by no means over for your family, and I imagine for your community.
No, it takes approximately 10 years to see the full effect that lead is going to have on you. Most recently, a very good friend of mine's daughter was just diagnosed with the liver of a 75-year-old, and she's 17. So this is an ongoing battle as far as health goes and as far as clean water goes.
So we described you in our introduction as a water activist and a citizen scientist. How did that happen?
Well, that happened because my kids started having health issues. Me and my husband started having health issues. In 2014, after the water switch, not realizing it was related, December of 2014, we had our first bout of brown water. And when we started talking to the city, we kept getting told that it was specific to our home. Nobody else was having these issues, and there was no media coverage on it. So we started going into city council meetings and special meetings that the city was holding in regards to the water. And one particular meeting in January of 2015, we went into this meeting, and there's all these people holding up bags of hair, which we were experiencing hair loss, showing off their rashes and pictures of their children's rashes, and holding up the same brown bottles of water that we were. And we were stunned. And so when me and my husband got in the car, the conversation pointed to, how is there all this physical evidence and nobody's listening to us, no one's taking us serious? And we decided to get to the science of it, because you can't argue with science. And so that's where my citizen scientist journey began. I started teaching myself about water distribution systems, the chemicals that go into water, and that's how I was able to figure out that they were breaking the federal law of not using the proper treatments in our water that was causing our issue.
Did you have a science background?
No, I don't. I was a medical assistant before all this started, and a stay-at-home mom after my twins were born. So this was something that I took upon myself while working in other groups, because these were my children at stake. This was my family at stake. And then we found out it was our whole community at stake.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to have you join us today is we're taking a look at how the philanthropic community responded to the crises of 2016. And as you heard from the report, there was considerable attention given to the Flint Water Crisis. But I'm wondering, from your perspective as a activist and a citizen scientist, what are you seeing as the biggest gaps in ongoing needs in Flint today, and how could philanthropy be helping?
Well, because there's no trust, none of the trust has been rebuilt with the government. So there is a PTSD mentality towards the water. And with that distrust, people still are not using it. We've gotten the lead levels down, but the bigger issue is the infrastructure. We are losing 50% of the water before it ever gets into anybody's home, and we're being billed for it. And that causes a huge problem in itself. One of the other things that we're seeing is nobody's using the water. For instance, the people that I work with, that I've been working with for the last 3 years, we have 119 people on our list that are homebound, disabled, and elderly, which we call our forgotten community, who we've been taking water to for the last 3 years. And since the free water pot stations went away, that has fallen onto us to continue to try and make sure these people who can't get access to clean water are still getting clean water. We've decided that we're taking a different approach to it. The water pod stations were amazing, with the donations that are still coming in from some organizations for that. The problem is you stand in line, for 3 to 6 hours to get maybe 3 cases of water a week or 8 cases of water a week, depending on your family size. That doesn't always work. Recently, Paul Simon, actually liking the vision that my group is putting together, donated him $15,000 to go towards our citizen scientist work to get us the tools that we need to continue. And he's with that, we're working with and trying to work with Culligan and Aspapure to try and get water coolers put into people's homes instead of the pod stations where you have to go pick up bottled water. So where we can show that we're giving people water for an entire year. So with the money that was donated from him, if we get this to work out with Culligan or Isopure, we'll be able to afford 20 people clean, affordable water for an entire year by putting a water cooler into their home. That's one of the major things that we are working on. On a national level, we've had, with me working and partnering with Virginia Tech, thousands upon thousands of people getting a hold of us, wanting us to test their water because they're concerned. And so we launched last year the U.S. Water Study Team. And so far we've gone into Louisiana, Denmark, and Chicago, and have been testing water there, trying to help them solve their water problems. The biggest help that I can see going forward in this is that with this being a man-made disaster, Flint was not eligible for the natural disaster reliefs. So that kind of left us in a bad situation. With the grassroots people that are in place, we pay for all of this out of our own pocket. So me trying to get the lead and copper rule changed, that's a personal mission, because what happened in our city should never happen to another child again. Trying to get those laws changed going into DC, those things happen as we're funded or as we save up enough money to go up there and be able to do those things. Grassroots organizations are often overlooked, and that makes it hard because we usually pay for a lot of stuff out of our own pocket. So my suggestion is, my hope is that maybe looking at grassroots organizations that will be willing to show accountability and transparency to their donors to say, this is what we're using this money for. This is how it's being used to help with what's going on in our community.
So you've won a number of national awards, the most recent being the North American Goldman Environmental Prize earlier this year. And I know you're now doing much more work nationally. Are you yourself traveling, and do you have plans for a national organization of some kind? And further, finally, the second part of that is, what can philanthropy be doing to assist not only you, but others in other communities that may be experiencing similar issues?
Well, we are trying to get it onto a national level because we definitely need more people signed on for the lead and copper rule changes. With that being said, if that doesn't change, then what happened in Flint has the potential to happen anywhere across the U.S. And that's a dangerous game with what's going on with the EPA and the changes that we keep hearing and the added time for that. So that's where we're really focusing right now. Our major goal for this, and we're still in the process of working on the national campaign, is making water a human right, not the new gold, because this is going to get worse before it gets better. We need to start looking at infrastructures. We need to start, like I said, the biggest thing is funding the grassroots and other communities that are going to need this help. One of the things that I've been going back and forth and talking with EPA and different congressional members is, okay, so we go in, we start testing, and we start seeing that there's this problem, but who's going to pay for this problem? And I'm trying to get them to work with me on getting a grant program together for rural communities to help them when we're finding these problems, so that this way they have a problem, but there's no way to fix it. This way there's something put to the side so that we can get this fixed.
Well, thank you so much for that. And our best wishes to you and your family and the Flint community. Can you stay on the line for just a little bit longer while we want to take a few questions now from those listening. But can you stay with us for just a while?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, let me take a few questions from the audience. And Larry, there's a few sort of technical questions on the data itself. And so let me ask you this first one. Is corporate giving data only from US-based corporations?
That's a good question, and goes to some of the challenges we try to address in pulling all of this data together year after year. We're interested, of course, in trying to get information from as many sources as possible. One of the hardest challenges is to get really comprehensive information about corporate giving, and the best source that we have identified to this point is to work with the Committee to Encourage Corporate Philanthropy, CECP. They are a membership organization consisting of some of the largest organizations in the world. Most of them are US, but it is a global organization. It's similar in many respects to the data that we have on foundation giving, in that Foundation Center has data on mostly US foundations and some non-US foundations. And we reported our total this year based on everything that we had, including some non-US foundations. But the vast majority of it is based on US foundations. It's very similar in the case of CECP. They are primarily going to reflect the giving of US-based organizations, but they do have some organizations that are internationally based among their members.
But as we mentioned, we're eager to have more corporations as well as foundations partner with us. We'd like to get much more specific data. So for those of you listening today who either represent a corporation or are part of organizations consisting of corporations, we would love to hear from you so that we can make this data even broader and deeper. Larry, another technical question. Can you please explain the difference in your definition between preparedness and resilience?
It's a fine distinction, and in some places it's a blurred line. But generally speaking, if you think about preparedness, a lot of it has to do with making sure that you have systems in place that kind of scan the environment for eventual disasters that may be predictable and can be, adequately prepared for. It has to do with awareness of disasters and educating people about what sorts of things they may want to do in case a disaster hits. Being ready either at the household level or at the community level to act in appropriate ways in the event of a disaster. having training, for example, so that people are feeling ready and know what to do when a disaster happens. And then also being cognizant of signs that tell you when things may be likely to happen, forecasting weather patterns, monitoring situations near sites with volcanoes and things like that, so that there is a sense of early warning that helps people understand what those signs are and what to do in the event of those signs. When you think of the resilience, disaster risk reduction and mitigation, a lot of it has to do with making sure that buildings are properly retrofitted so that you minimize the actual damage that happens, so that you basically are making sure that you have the structures that enable you to withstand the event of a disaster. So preparedness is sort of leaning in the direction of knowing what to do, and resilience, risk reduction, and mitigation has to do with making sure that systems are in place and buildings are reinforced and generally speaking, the structural elements are ready to withstand a disaster, so that the recovery period is less onerous.
LeeAnne Walters from Flint, as you've heard from this presentation, the vast majority of philanthropic dollars are given immediately after the disaster occurs. And you in Flint obviously didn't have the time to plan for this disaster, but I wonder, as you begin to think about activities on a national level, if you're beginning to pay attention in the communities you work in to things like planning and preparedness and even mitigation.
Yes, that has been a huge topic of what we are working on. And that's why with going to the national level, that's one of the things that we want to focus on. That's where the grants come in to help other rural communities that are having water issues once they are discovered. That's why we're trying to launch with Asperpure or Culligan, putting the water coolers in people's home to show that we've used the money to go long-term for a year versus a week or 2 weeks. We've based it down to, from the raw numbers we have so far, it's to the equivalent of a Starbucks cup of coffee a day to sponsor a home in Flint for a year. Getting the prepared and readiness part of it, if we can make that happen, it helps us going forward in other communities when they're having these issues. It's helpful to the environment, not using all these individual bottles of water. So we're looking at the big picture as we go forward.
Thanks. Another question from a listener is, will today's presentation be shared with participants? And the answer is yes. If you signed up for today's webinar, you'll be sent a copy of the recording as well as the slides. And the slides are also will be available on our website. Larry, another technical question, is Puerto Rico data aggregated into US data or included in the Caribbean subset?
That is included in the US data, and obviously we'll be probably looking very carefully to break out information about Puerto Rico in next year's report when we look at the response of philanthropy to Hurricane Maria and the devastation that it created in Puerto Rico. But yes, we put that into the US data.
So now a few more philosophical questions, and maybe both of us can give responses here. This first one is, in your view, how do you suggest response organizations encourage increased giving around the areas of resilience and preparedness, given the need for organizations to prepare as much as possible ahead of disasters? and I guess I can get started on that one. And several questions are along this line. And I'd say it is perhaps not a trend yet, but there is a growing realization that our current approaches to disasters are insufficient and not sustainable, that the number of disasters is growing so rapidly that we need to do a better job of preparing for disasters, that only giving money after a disaster occurs doesn't really make us any stronger or make our communities any stronger or make us better able to respond to the next disaster that comes along. So we're beginning to see movements around the country around planning, around preparation, even in mitigation. There's been some big mitigation projects in places like New York and New Jersey, and now in San Francisco and Miami and Louisiana, where people are starting to take a more strategic perspective. The data that we shared with you today doesn't reflect what I would call a trend yet, but there certainly is a growing awareness of the issue. Anything you want to add to that, Larry?
Yes, I think we talk about this report every year with the subtitle, Data to Drive Decisions. And in this case, one of the ways to think about the potential usefulness of the data in this report in response to this issue in particular is that simply by being able to quote a reliable statistic about the proportion of all disaster-related giving that goes to response and recovery as opposed to preparedness, for example, gives you some leverage by being able to point out just how lopsided the giving is in favor of response and recovery. It points to a lack of attention, relatively speaking, to the issue of preparedness and mitigation. So I think being armed with data like this is one of the hopes of this effort, that we can help people see where these gaps exist and make conscious choices to not necessarily follow your instincts, but to perhaps think a little bit more carefully about where your investments may actually make more of a difference, relatively speaking.
Larry, next question. What are the trends you see in international humanitarian giving post-2016? How much of these have been affected due to after the new administration was sworn in?
That is a question that we have received in a number of different forms in the last couple of years, as you might well expect. We deal, unfortunately, with a bit of lag time before we have enough data to say anything about trends. It's too early for us to have a large enough database to say whether or not giving has increased or not as a result of the new administration. We're interested in putting together a system to track giving as we get it that begins to answer some of these questions. For example, there's a lot of concern about whether efforts to give in relation to climate issues are increasing or not. At the time that the new administration came into office, U.S. was a party to the Paris Accord. Now it is not. So a lot of organizations that are interested in climate issues want very much to know whether or not philanthropy, for example, is stepping up in that area. As of right now, we don't have a definitive answer, but because people are interested in seeing what sorts of changes may be occurring, as the political environment has changed, we're going to try to develop ways of giving people sort of a rolling, continuous view of what we're learning as we go until we can finally come up with some definitive trend information once we have enough data. It's a very important question, and we're going to try to find new ways to address it.
Good, thank you. And I know people are interested in knowing about dollars going to climate change in particular. Next question, Larry. Do you or any other players track in-kind donations, such as volunteer efforts, both hands-on and skills-based?
We have tried to get some information about in-kind efforts from limited sources of information, I would say. There are some philanthropic organizations that do report in-kind giving on their annual tax forms by putting a dollar value on it so that it can be credited towards the annual charitable giving requirement to meet their payout requirements. The methods by which that information is currently being provided do not give us, a way to get a definitive number in terms of the amount of in-kind giving. We have explored the possibility of doing survey work with organizations that are involved in that we know of that are involved in in-kind giving in order to get some sort of a cross-section of that kind of giving. But that is something that we don't have a really good handle on at this point. And it's interesting to note that, while we do have 12 different data sources that we're using right now to compile this report every year, which is an increase from the number of sources that we had in year one, we are still looking for better ways to document in-kind giving.
And I'd say that's one of the key areas where we're hoping we can find volunteers or partners who are willing to help us aggregate this data. Leanne Walters, I'm wondering if you could give us your experience working with donations of product and then also donations of services. We sometimes hear that it helps a lot, but then we also hear of instances where donations of products becomes a problem. What was your experience in Flint?
The donations that came into Flint were fantastic when we had the water pods. That's where the majority of the donations went to. We've gone through that. We've gone through the free water that the state was giving us as well because of the need for it in the city of Flint. So now people are left choosing between paying a water bill and buying water that they can drink and cook with or buying food. And that's where the biggest problem is in the city, that and the unforgotten community where, like, for instance, with our own time, our own gas money, our own vehicles, me and the partners I work with, we're going to the water pod stations 4 or 5 times a day, multiple times a week, gathering up water for these people who are not getting water delivered to them like they were supposed to through the CORE program.
But in general, the donations of products turned out to be a positive for the Flint community.
Yeah, in general, they were a positive and they were amazing. I'm not downing that at all. It helped us get through the roughest of what was happening during the time. The planning aspect of it was where the shortcoming came into, because it sustained us in water for that year, but it's not sustained going forward.
Right, gotcha. All right, we got just a few more minutes left. Larry, a couple of other technical questions. Will we be using Facebook donation data and Class C donation data in the 2017 report?
We have, in fact, reached out to Facebook, and we are hoping that something can be arranged so that we can include that as a source of information for this report. Platforms like Facebook are obviously part of a change in the way that people provide donations for all causes. And it's imperative, I think, that we understand just how donations are enabled through new kinds of mechanisms that may not be well captured when we focus our attention on things like corporate giving and philanthropic giving. You know, as we noted, the amount of individual giving worldwide is in the billions of dollars compared to, you know, the hundreds of millions of dollars we were able to document in terms of institutional philanthropic giving. So being able to capture the mechanisms by which that individual giving is happening and staying as current as possible is the only way we're going to be able to provide information that, you know, remains relevant, I think, in terms of how to talk about coordination among all the different sources of giving and understanding how it all adds up.
Well, we're nearing the end of this webinar. LeeAnne Walters, do you have some last advice to donors who might be out there today as they think about this next year, as they try to become more strategic? What kind of advice from your experience in Flint would you have for them?
Well, first I want to, for me and for everybody else in Flint, thank you for everybody who has thought of Flint and who has donated into Flint. It did make a difference. I don't want it to come off like it didn't, because it did in our hour of need. The advice would be to think about what people are going to use the money for long term, what the game plan is for the temporary and going forward, and to really look at the grassroots organizations that are involved to see how you can help them, and see if you're getting the accountability and transparency to make sure everything is getting used to help in the crisis the way it needs to be.
Well, thank you so much, and best wishes to you and your family and the community in Flint. Larry, any last minute thoughts from you?
I had seen a question here that actually I think is very interesting in light of what we're talking about today, and that is the one that has to do with donor interest potentially in building environmental resilience instead of just structural. For example, planting mangroves and seagrasses to mitigate against coastal floods. This gives us a chance to talk about the boundaries around which we have you know, the boundaries we've drawn around what we talk about in these reports. We are focusing on what is very specifically identified as disaster-related philanthropy, but we are looking for cues in the way these grants are described to figure out whether they're disaster-related or not. The work that many foundations are doing goes far beyond disaster-specific kind of grant making to basically thinking long-term in long-term environmental ways to address things on an environmental or structural basis that may in fact mitigate against the impact of disasters in the future. That is a circle of grant making that is outside of the scope of what we typically focus on, but absolutely not irrelevant to understanding how funders can play a role in this work. I'm also reminded that in 2016, it was the year of the Pulse nightclub shooting. We have not focused, for example, on those kinds of crises that have occurred as part of the normal scope of what we consider to be disaster-related philanthropy. But many people would argue that we do need to be thinking about those kinds of situations and the role of philanthropy, when we're talking about this kind of work in those situations as well. So I want to just mention, and in response to that, seeing that question, that this focus that we have is more specific perhaps than a lot of the good work that does have a bearing on how foundations can position themselves in doing this work.
All right, well, thank you very much. That's Larry McGill. And thank you, Larry, for providing an overview of the report and the tools. And I want to remind everyone that the report and accompanying tools can be found at disasterphilanthropy.foundations foundationcenter.org. I also want to thank all of our other friends who did so much for this report at the Foundation Center. We appreciate your partnership and all of your hard work. Thanks so much for LeeAnne Walters from Flint for joining us today. And we benefited from her perspectives. Thank you, LeeAnne. I want to thank my colleagues at CDP, Ruja and Tanya and Melanie for all of their hard work on this webinar as well. If you've got questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's call, you may email them to Tanya Gulliver Garcia at disasterphilanthropy.org. I'm Bob Ottenhoff, and I want to thank you and wish you a great afternoon. Thanks.